If you think you're doing everything right, that's probably why it's going wrong. Few men have the courage to face this, but the truth is simple. Attraction isn't built on good intentions. If it were, you'd just have to be kind, present, available, and everything would work. But it doesn't, and it never has. Machiavelli understood this centuries ago. Politics guided by reality, not ideals. And when you bring that into the game of attraction, everything changes. Because suddenly you realize it's not about being good, it's about being perceived as valuable. And here's the uncomfortable part. Many of the behaviors you believe help you are actually slowly destroying your image without you realizing it. Small actions, responding too quickly, always being available, validating everything, avoiding conflict, not taking a stand, seem harmless. But together, they create a silent perception of weakness. And real human nature doesn't respond to weakness with attraction, it responds with disinterest. The problem is that nobody explains this to you directly. On the contrary, they teach you the opposite. They tell you to please more, to try harder, to show off more. But the more you do that, the less you are valued. And that generates frustration, confusion, that feeling of, I do everything right, and yet it doesn't work. And it is precisely here that most give up without realizing that they were just playing the wrong game. But what if the problem was never you, but rather the way you were taught to act? What if there were a set of invisible flaws, behavioral patterns, that when corrected would completely change the way people perceive you? That's exactly what you're about to understand. If something inside you awakened while listening, don't ignore that feeling. This channel isn't about videos, it's about memories. Remember who you were before the fear, before the exhaustion, before the silence. Each new video here is a different reflection of your own soul, an invitation to understand what the world never taught you. The power you seek outside has always been within you. If you feel that this journey speaks to what lives silently within you, sign up now. Not to follow yet another creator, but to reconnect with something the world tried to make you forget. Because here, every word was made to heal, each reflection to awaken, and each video serves as a reminder. You are not alone on the path back to yourself. Click on subscribe and turn the algorithm into a daily reminder of who you really are. He often says he wants to be more attractive, more respected, more desired. But without realizing it, he does the exact opposite every day. And the most curious thing is that it's not for lack of trying, it's for lack of understanding of reality. Machiavelli already spoke about this. Politics guided by reality, not by ideals. And when it comes to human relationships, especially attraction, the rule is the same. It doesn't matter what he thinks should work. What matters is what actually works in human nature. And that's where the first mistake begins, acting based on good intentions, not on real effects. He tries to be too nice, tries to please, tries to be validated, without realizing that he is giving up his own perception of value. And here's something few people talk about clearly. Attraction isn't built with visible effort, but with strategic perception. The end justifies the means, but not in the vulgar sense many interpret it. Rather, in the sense of understanding that the result matters more than the intention. If his actions are diminishing respect, then something needs to be recalibrated. And that requires facing the stark truth. Always being available, always predictable, always emotionally exposed, doesn't generate value. On the contrary, in many cases, it generates saturation, and saturation never builds desire. That's where the interplay between virtù and fortuna comes in, the ability to act with precision and the capacity to read the right moment. He begins to realize then that it's not about doing more, but about doing better, about managing presence, about understanding timing, about knowing when to advance and when to retreat. A simple example. Responding to messages immediately all the time might seem like attention, but strategically it can eliminate any tension or curiosity. And without tension, there is no sustained interest. It's like a series that gives everything away in the first episode. Nobody keeps watching. And without realizing it, he's doing exactly that with his own presence. He gives everything away too quickly, too easily. And this is where the turning point begins, because he understands that it's not about manipulating anyone. It's about stopping self-sabotage, about stopping acting against his own image, about aligning behavior with perceived value, avoiding being hated, yes, but also avoiding being ignored, because in the social game, being irrelevant is worse than being rejected. And when he begins to see this clearly, he realizes that the problem was never a lack of effort. It was excess in the wrong place. And this opens the door to the next point, perhaps one of the most ignored of all. He believes that the more he validates, the more he achieves. It seems logical, but that's not how human nature responds. Machiavelli already made it clear, decisions should be based on real human nature, not on what seems fair or beautiful. And here's the point that few dare to face. Excessive praise loses value. Constant attention becomes noise. When everything is validated, nothing stands out. And without realizing it, he transforms something rare, approval, into something common. And what is common is rarely desired. The problem was never praising. It was not knowing how to moderate. It's like someone who uses too much perfume. Instead of attracting, it repels. Now, when he begins to apply calculated use of force, not physical but behavioral, everything changes. He understands that validation needs to come at specific moments, almost as a reward for something real. And this creates contrast, and contrast creates perception. For example, instead of praising appearance all the time, he observes something specific, posture, attitude, a decision, and comments on it in a pointed way. This generates impact. This differentiates. This leaves a mark. And more importantly, this doesn't put him in the position of someone seeking approval, but of someone giving it. And this inversion completely changes the game. Better to be feared than loved. Here, the more sophisticated interpretation is, better to be respected than predictable. And that's where a concept that separates amateurs from strategists comes in. Intermittent reinforcement. Not always present, not always available, not always validating. This creates a pattern that the brain tries to decipher, and everything the brain tries to understand, it begins to value more. It's that simple. A practical example. He doesn't respond to all messages at the same pace, doesn't react to everything with the same intensity, doesn't always praise. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. And this controlled oscillation generates curiosity, it generates attention, it generates emotional investment from the other side. And without realizing it, he stops being just another one and starts to occupy space. But this requires something many lack: constant adaptability, knowing how to adjust behavior without losing one's essence. Because if it's too artificial, it breaks. If it's too predictable, it disappears. The balance lies in observing, calibrating, acting, and observing again. Virtù and fortuna, once more. And it is precisely at this point that he begins to realize that it's not just about what he does, but about what he fails to do. And this prepares the ground for something even more powerful, the ability to not be fully understood. He believes that total transparency generates connection, and, in part, that even seems true. But in practice, when everything is predictable, nothing is intriguing. Machiavelli already understood this with brutal clarity. Politics guided by reality, not by ideals. And reality is simple. What can be completely predicted loses strategic value. There is no tension, there is no curiosity, there is no reason for the other person to invest energy trying to understand, and without realizing it, they become an open book, but a book that has already been read. And nobody rereads something that holds no mystery. Here's a classic mistake. He reveals everything about himself too quickly. What he thinks, what he feels, what he wants, all right at the beginning. It seems like honesty, but strategically, it's overexposure. The end justifies the means, and the result is clear: a progressive loss of interest, because the human mind thrives on discovery. When there's nothing left to discover, the brain simply redirects its focus. A simple example: he recounts his entire routine, his plans, his intentions, and eliminates any room for curiosity. He leaves no gaps. And it's precisely those gaps that keep someone thinking. When he begins to understand the calculated use of force in this context, he realizes that he doesn't need to lie or pretend, just filter. Not everything needs to be said immediately. Not everything needs to be fully revealed. He can respond without giving everything away. He can share without exposing himself completely. He can be clear without being entirely predictable. This creates a different dynamic, a presence that is not easy to decipher. And what is not easy to decipher naturally attracts more attention, because it requires cognitive effort, and everything that requires effort gains value. And then comes the most powerful factor here: strategic absence. He doesn't need to be available all the time. He doesn't need to answer everything immediately. He doesn't need to participate in every conversation. Sometimes silence communicates more than any sentence. Avoiding being hated, yes, but also avoiding being excessively accessible, because constant accessibility eliminates any sense of accomplishment. And when there is no accomplishment, there is no appreciation. It's simple, but profound. And when he starts applying this naturally, something curious happens. People begin to try to understand him more. They ask more questions, they observe more, they think more, and this completely changes the dynamic. He stops chasing after things and starts being interpreted. And this opens up space for something even more advanced: the ability to read the other person even before the other person understands themselves. He thinks he's doing well because the conversation flows, because there's an exchange, because everything seems normal. But that's precisely the problem. He only sees what's being said and completely ignores what's being felt. Machiavelli already implied this. Decisions based on real human nature. And human nature isn't revealed in words. It's revealed between the lines, in the tone of voice, in the response time, in the small changes in behavior. And whoever doesn't read that is playing in the dark. And whoever plays in the dark inevitably gets the timing wrong. What differentiates an ordinary person from someone strategically attractive is the ability to name emotions even before the other person can express them, not in an invasive way, but precisely. He begins to observe patterns: when she responds more briefly, when she takes longer, when her tone changes. And instead of ignoring or reacting generically, he brings awareness to it. Something simple, like, "You've been quieter lately. Did something happen?" But said naturally, without pressure. This generates an immediate feeling of understanding. And few things are more powerful than feeling understood without having to explain. Here again, the concept of virtù and fortuna comes into play. The ability to act with sensitivity, virtù, at the right moment, fortuna. Because it's not enough to perceive, you need to know when and how to speak. If he points something out at the wrong time, it can lead to isolation. If he ignores it completely, he loses connection. The balance lies in calibration, and this is built with practice, observation, real attention. It's not about memorized technique. It's about presence. And presence is something rare these days. A practical example, during a conversation, she comments on something seemingly neutral, but the tone changes. Instead of glossing over it, he slows down and explores it lightly. You said that a little differently now. It seems like there's something there. This opens up space. This deepens the conversation. This creates a real emotional connection. And at the same time, it positions him as someone who sees beyond the obvious. And those who see beyond the obvious naturally stand out. But there's a detail that few realize. When someone feels deeply understood, they begin to form a bond. And a bond, when well managed, generates emotional investment. And it's precisely at this point that many make a critical mistake, because they don't know how to sustain what they've created. And that's where the next point comes in, perhaps one of the most delicate of all. Once he starts to connect, understand emotions, create presence, a new risk arises. He becomes too constant, always there, always ready, always accessible. And again, it seems like a positive thing. But human nature doesn't respond that way. Machiavelli already showed us, politics guided by reality, not by ideals. And in reality, what is always available loses perceived value. Not because it ceases to be good, but because it ceases to be rare. And the human brain values what is scarce, not what is abundant. Here's a point that few men understand. It's not presence that generates value, it's the perception of it. If he's available all the time, responds at the same speed, participates in everything, he eliminates any space for anticipation. And without anticipation, there's no emotion. It's like watching a movie without suspense. Everything happens, but nothing impacts you. The calculated use of force in this case isn't about coldly withdrawing. It's about creating rhythm. Presence, absence, presence again. This generates a cycle that keeps interest alive. A practical example. He doesn't always need to respond immediately. He doesn't need to be online all the time. He doesn't need to accept every invitation. He can naturally prioritize his own life, training, work, projects, and this communicates something silent but powerful. He has his own world. And someone who has their own world doesn't revolve around anyone, and that completely changes perception. Better to be feared than loved. Here, a more refined interpretation is better to be respected than constantly accessible. But be warned, this isn't about playing games, because when it's artificial, the other person notices. And that's where constant adaptability comes in. It adjusts without exaggerating. It fades without disappearing. It reappears without suffocating. It's a delicate balance, and whoever masters this naturally creates positive emotional tension, that feeling of, I want to see more, I want to understand more. And this keeps interest active without forced effort. And then something interesting happens. When he stops being always available, the other side starts to fill that space. They start searching more, investing more, thinking more. And this completely changes the power dynamic. Because in the end, whoever invests more emotionally values more. And it is precisely at this point that a new challenge arises, knowing how to sustain this position without losing consistency. It might even generate attraction, create connection, maintain curiosity. But if it doesn't convey stability, all of that crumbles over time. And here lies one of the biggest silent mistakes: overreacting, oscillating too much, letting yourself be carried away by the environment, by the other person's emotions, by situations. Machiavelli already showed this clearly, decisions based on real human nature. And the reality is that emotionally unstable people don't generate security. And without security, there's no building something deeper. There might even be interest, but there's no support. The point here isn't to be cold, quite the opposite. It's about being firm. It's about being someone who feels but doesn't lose their composure, who understands what's happening but doesn't react impulsively. The calculated use of force appears precisely here. He chooses when to speak, when to remain silent, when to act. He doesn't engage in unnecessary arguments. He doesn't lose control over small things. He doesn't try to win emotionally. He maintains his composure. And this communicates something very powerful without needing to say a word. He is reliable under pressure. A practical example: a moment of tension arises, an argument, a misunderstanding, a change in behavior. Instead of reacting with anxiety, resentment, or insecurity, he slows down. He listens, he observes, he responds clearly and calmly. Something like, "Let's understand what happened before drawing any conclusions." Simple, direct, no drama. This breaks the expected pattern. Because most people react, he leads. And whoever leads naturally assumes a different position. And here again, virtue and fortune come into play. The ability to maintain inner control, virtue, in the face of unpredictable situations, fortune. Because it's no use being stable when everything is going well. The real test is when something gets out of control. And it is in these moments that most people reveal themselves. Some lose their bearings. Others try to control others. But few keep their own structure intact. And it is these few who stand out. And when he starts acting like that, something changes in perception. He stops being seen merely as interesting and starts being seen as someone solid. And solidity generates something much stronger than momentary interest. It generates emotional trust. And trust, when well built, opens doors that simple attraction would never open. But this also brings a new challenge, because along with trust comes observation. And that's where the next point comes in. He may be interesting in conversation, emotionally stable, a good reader, but if his outward perception is weak, all of that loses its power. And here comes a principle that Machiavelli mastered like few others: the appearance of virtue. It's not enough to be, you have to appear to be, and not in a superficial sense, but in a strategic sense. Because in the social game, perception is reality. And people don't react to what he is internally. They react to what they can see. Most people completely ignore this. They think that being a good person or having substance is enough, but real human nature works differently. Status, presence, posture, environment, all of this communicates value even before any words are spoken. Decisions based on real human nature, remember? He may be incredible, but if he doesn't convey that, nobody invests enough time to find out. And in today's fast-paced world, those who don't communicate value immediately are ignored. Here, the calculated use of force comes into play in a more subtle way. He begins to build presence without needing to constantly talk about himself. A firmer posture, more direct communication, less need to justify himself. He is more selective about where he is, who he is with, and what he shows. A practical example: instead of trying to impress by talking too much about achievements, he lets the environment and behavior communicate that. A well-structured routine, a select social circle, clear objectives. This generates something silent, but extremely powerful, perceived authority. And then an interesting detail emerges. He begins to be observed. People start trying to understand who he is, what he does, how he thinks. And this completely changes the dynamic. He stops trying to convince and begins to be interpreted. Is it better to be feared than loved? Here, the refined interpretation is, it's better to be respected even before being understood, because respect opens up space, and space allows for depth. But there's a critical point. If that image isn't consistent with the behavior, it breaks down. And that's where constant adaptability comes in. He adjusts, aligns, maintains consistency, because perception without consistency turns into distrust. And distrust destroys any construction. And when he begins to sustain that presence naturally, something even deeper begins to happen. The other person's own contradictions begin to appear more clearly. He observes, creates connection, builds presence, but makes a silent mistake. He doesn't pay attention to inconsistencies, neither his own nor those of others. And this, over time, corrodes any construction. Machiavelli already showed us decisions based on real human nature, and human nature is full of contradictions. People say one thing, do another, feel one thing, express another, and whoever doesn't perceive this ends up accepting any narrative without questioning, and in the end loses control of the dynamic. The point here isn't to confront aggressively, it's to bring awareness with precision, calculated use of force once again. He begins to listen more attentively, observe patterns, and when he notices inconsistencies, he brings them up directly, but calmly. Something like, "You said you value X, but you acted in Y way. That doesn't add up." No attack, no judgment, just clarity. And this generates a powerful effect. It breaks automatic patterns, because most people aren't used to being confronted with consistency, and when that happens, something changes. A practical example. She says she likes stability, but maintains chaotic behaviors. Instead of ignoring it or trying to fix it, he simply points it out and observes the reaction. This is fundamental, because it's not what she says that matters, it's what she does afterward, and this brings a much more realistic understanding of the situation. The end justifies the means. Here, the result is clarity. He stops living on promises and starts operating based on real behavior. But this also demands something from him, his own consistency, because if he demands and doesn't deliver, he instantly loses authority. The appearance of virtue only works when there's a minimum alignment with practice. Otherwise, it becomes theater, and theater over time is perceived, and when it's perceived, it completely breaks down respect. And without respect, nothing can stand. And then he begins to realize something deeper. When there is coherence, interactions become simpler. Less noise, less doubt, more clarity, and this allows him to make better decisions, including the most difficult one of all, deciding when to stay and when to leave. And it is precisely at this point that the next level comes in. He already understands validation, scarcity, emotional reading, presence, but he still makes a subtle mistake. He waits for too many signs. He waits for approval. He waits for confirmation. He waits for the perfect moment. And while he waits, he loses leadership. Machiavelli already made this clear in an almost brutal way. Virtù and fortuna, acting firmly in the face of uncertainty. Because those who wait too long don't lead, they react. And those who react are always one step behind. True human nature responds to direction, not hesitation. When he demonstrates clarity, even without all the answers, something changes in perception. He doesn't need to be authoritarian, but he needs to be decisive. Calculated use of force again. He suggests, guides, proposes. A simple example, instead of asking, "What do you want to do?" he says, "Let's do it on such and such a day." Direct, clear, no beating around the bush. That's not control, it's direction. And direction conveys security. And here's a point that few understand. Constant indecision is interpreted as weakness, not because he doesn't know, but because he doesn't take responsibility. And taking risks is part of the game. The end justifies the means, not in the sense of going over everything, but understanding that action generates results, while hesitation generates stagnation. And stagnation doesn't create attraction, doesn't create respect, doesn't create movement. A practical example, he wants to schedule something, but he keeps waiting for the right moment, the right atmosphere, the right signal. Meanwhile, nothing happens. Someone with a firm presence, however, simply acts, with lightness but decisively, and even if the response isn't always positive, the stance remains. And this, in the long run, builds something much more valuable: respect. And then he realizes something that completely changes the game. Leadership isn't about controlling others, it's about not getting lost in your own indecision. And when he embraces this, the dynamic changes. He stops being driven by circumstances and starts influencing the course of interactions. And this opens the door to the final point, the most crucial of all. He may have learned everything up to this point: validation, scarcity, presence, reading, direction. But if he doesn't have clear boundaries, everything crumbles. And that's the most dangerous mistake of all, because it doesn't appear at the beginning, it appears over time. Little by little, he begins to tolerate small things: mild disrespect, lack of reciprocity, inconsistent attitudes. And he overlooks them, he adjusts them, he tries to maintain them, and, without realizing it, he begins to negotiate his own value. Machiavelli already implied this: avoid being hated, but never at the cost of losing authority. Here's the key point: self-respect isn't something you declare, it's something you demonstrate through your behavior. Calculated use of force, once again. He doesn't need to argue, he doesn't need to threaten, he doesn't need to create drama. He simply sets boundaries and respects them. Simple as that. If something crosses what he considers acceptable, he takes a stand. And, if necessary, he walks away. Without a spectacle, without excessive justifications, because those who over-justify are often trying to convince, not to take a stand. A practical example: recurring disrespect, evident disinterest, contradictory attitudes. Instead of trying to fix or insist, he observes, communicates clearly once, and then acts. This could mean reducing contact or withdrawing completely. And this generates an immediate effect. Either the other person adjusts their behavior, or the dynamic ends. The end justifies the means. Here, the result is the preservation of value. And preserved value always finds better opportunities. And then comes a concept that few truly internalize: it's better to be feared than loved. But in a more sophisticated interpretation, it's better to be respected than tolerated. Because being tolerated means that one has given up something essential. And when someone gives up their own value, the world responds in kind. Decisions based on real human nature. Always. And it is at this point that everything comes together. Because when he has boundaries, presence, direction, and clarity, he no longer needs to convince anyone of anything. He simply positions himself, and those who recognize this stay. Those who don't leave. And this isn't a loss, it's a filter. And when he truly understands this, something definitively changes in the way he operates. And it is precisely here that everything that has been built begins to make sense. Now answer me honestly. How many of these things have you realized you already do without even noticing? How many times have you tried to be more present, more available, more understanding, thinking that this would increase attraction, when in reality it was decreasing your perceived value? The truth is, nobody taught you how to play this game based on reality. They taught you beautiful ideas, but they didn't teach you how human nature really works. And Machiavelli already made this clear. Politics guided by reality, not by ideals. Now you have two choices. The first is to ignore all of this, continue acting the same way, and expect different results. The second is to apply, observe, adjust. Start operating consciously. You don't need to change everything at once, but you need to start. Small changes in behavior, when aligned with the right perception, generate giant transformations. Virtu and Fortuna, action with strategy at the right time. And let me tease you a little more. Are you being respected or merely tolerated? Are you being chosen or just available? Are you driving or waiting to be driven? These questions may be unsettling, and they should be, because it is from this discomfort that real change is born. The end justifies the means, and the result here is simple. Either you take a clear stance, or the world positions you in the most convenient place for it. Now tell me, are you going to continue playing the way you always have, or are you going to start playing by understanding the rules? If this content brought you clarity, please like and subscribe to the channel, because here you won't find pretty phrases, you'll find real game analysis. And if you want to learn how to position yourself with more presence, more strategy, and more respect, turn on notifications, because this is just the beginning.